Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend, born in the shadow of Mount Sipylus. Have you ever wondered how a queen who carried in her veins the blood of the mighty Atlas and Zeus himself, the father of the gods, could overturn the delicate balance of the entire universe with a single sentence? Niobe was not just a ruler. She was the living monument of a pride that had been blinded by the splendor of her 14 children, challenged the goddesses, and gone so far as to say, "I am greater even than the blows of fate." However, the silver-bowed twins of Olympus, Apollo and Artemis were about to glide down from the sky like deadly shadows and shatter this false illusion of invulnerability within seconds with blood and screams. How much destruction could a mother's soul endure while watching her children turn into targets one by one? And how could such agony transform flesh and bone into a cold, voiceless rock? Was that mysterious, weeping rock, which still shed tears on the steep slopes of Manisa today, merely a natural phenomenon? Or was it a frozen testament standing on that ominous boundary where pride ended and eternal mourning began? Prepare to witness one of the most devastating downfalls of the ancient world, that immense transformation in which grief was carved into matter and the silent sobs of a petrified motherhood that had not ceased for thousands of years. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and like truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Niobe's petrified motherhood begins now. Niobe was born in the lands where the long shadow of Mount Sipylos slowly spread across the plain each evening. From the very first days of her childhood, she grew up not in an ordinary house, but in a palace where stone columns gave off coolness, bronze doors shone in the daylight, and even the servants moved about with lowered voices. Her father Tantalos's name was spoken with admiration and unease not only in his own land, but even in distant realms. For he was one of the rare men who, though mortal, had been admitted to the table of the gods. From infancy onward, Niobe opened her eyes into this splendor. The sense of security that had settled into the palace walls gave her very early on the feeling that every blessing in the world belonged to her family. Her child's heart took the order she saw around her as the natural state of fate. As the wind of Sipylos brushed her hair, she also began, in silence, to learn the great difference between her own life and the lives of the ordinary people who lived on the mountain's slopes. It was in those first years that the seed of her disaster fell into the earth without anyone noticing. Whenever Tantalos returned from Olympos, the air of the palace changed. The servants walked more carefully, the tables were set with greater magnificence, and everyone tried to understand from the king's face what had happened in the presence of the gods. Niobe, meanwhile, moved around her father, trying to draw into herself that indescribable splendor that came from him, almost as if it were a sacred sign. Everything Tantalos told turned the gods in the little girl's mind, into beings who were not unreachable, but close presences whose names were spoken in the family circle. Those great names that inspired fear in others became, for Niobe, powerful neighbors with whom her father spoke, sometimes amused, and at times even tested the limits of. Her childish mind was led into the most dangerous illusion here. If she was the daughter of a father who could stand so close to the gods, then she herself could not be considered beneath them. At first, this thought seemed like nothing more than a vague pride, but as the years passed, that pride quietly turned into a habit that grew within her and wore away all measure. What nourished Niobe most was not only the wealth of the palace, it was the story of the blood that was said to run through her veins. From a very young age, she heard whispers that she was the granddaughter of Atlas and came from the line of Zeus. Even as a child, she did not listen to these words as though they were a tale. She embraced them as truth. When she looked down from the high balcony of the palace at the fertile plains below, she did not see her position above the people of the plain as merely physical. She began to believe that they truly stood beneath her. Each time she looked at her own face, she did not see only a young princess. She thought she saw the radiance of a being related to the gods. For that reason, praise never seemed excessive to her. On the contrary, it always seemed insufficient. No matter how often people said she was beautiful, her ear kept searching for more. No matter how fully her nobility was acknowledged, a restlessness still stirred within her, insisting that she had not yet been recognized enough. The childhood days she spent in Sipylos fed this swelling sense of superiority in Niobe's heart, a little more with each passing year. In those years, one of the names most often seen beside Niobe was Leto, a goddess. The two of them climbed the slopes together, skipped stones beside the streams, gathered wildflowers, and spent the long summer days in the coolness beyond the palace grounds. There was a quiet, deep and unadorned dignity in Leto's nature. Niobe, even at that age, loved to be seen, to be noticed, and to have people speak of her wherever she was mentioned. Even so, because childhood covered the differences within people for a while, a real closeness was formed between the two girls. Niobe often interpreted Leto's calm not as wisdom, but as timidity. That, in turn, created in her a dangerous sense of superiority. Even while their friendship continued, comparison had already begun. Against Leto's silence, she placed her own liveliness, and against Leto's restraint, she put forward her own brilliance. There was no open hostility yet, but the first shadow of rivalry had appeared in Niobe's gaze. Even in the games of a child's heart that might have seemed innocent, that vein of contempt, which would one day bring terrible consequences, had already begun to make itself felt. Behind the shining face of the palace, however, another story moved in silence. The closeness Tantalos had formed with the gods gave him not wisdom, but reckless boldness. Certain words moved through the palace walls, first spoken in whispers, and then silenced in fear. People said that the king brought back things from the divine table that were not his, that he dared to test the limits of the gods, and even that he had challenged the sacred order. Niobe heard these rumors as she grew, but she did not take them as warnings. She took them as proof of her father's greatness. Tantalos's error did not awaken caution in her. It awakened admiration. She saw her father's refusal to bow even to the gods as a kind of royal nobility. Yet the old wise men of the palace knew that disaster often first settled into the heart of a bloodline. Even when Niobe noticed the worry in their eyes, she did not understand its meaning. To her, fear was a feeling fit for ordinary people. Her own family, by contrast, stood somewhere above fear. In this way, the shadow of Tantalos's crimes quietly began to seep into his daughter's character. By the time Niobe reached adolescence, her beauty and nobility had become the talk of everyone around her. But this attention gave rise in her not to grace, but to an overflowing sense of self. The manners, restraint, and humility taught to her in the palace remained words and nothing more, because life constantly showed her that she was privileged. Wherever she went, she heard compliments. Whichever hall she entered, she drew every gaze. Whomever she spoke to, she made them feel her superiority. Even the childhood closeness between her and Leto no longer remained in the same simplicity. As Niobe looked at her friend, she compared them inwardly and found her own lineage, appearance, and future brighter. At times, even in a single glance, one could feel a silent hardness that said, "I was more." She had not yet committed a great wrong, but losing all measure often began not with one great step, but with small excesses turning into habit. That was how Niobe changed. Every word of praise loosened her limits a little more. Every privilege wore down the balance within her a little further. And so the childhood that passed on the slopes of Sipylus, though it appeared bright and fruitful from the outside, carried within it the darkness of the future. Niobe was born in the palace of Tantalos, raised in a house where the names of those who shared the god's table were spoken, drew into herself in her earliest years the pride of descending from Atlas and Zeus, formed a friendship with Leto, yet nourished the desire to prevail even within that friendship. Most importantly, she saw her father's recklessness not as a warning, but as a display of power that ought to be imitated. That was the true beginning of the disaster. While still a child, she learned to look down on the limits drawn for her. As the cool winds of Sipylos brushed her face, that same mountain silently waited for her as the place that would one day become the grave of her sorrow. Niobe did not know this in those days. She only thought that life had treated her with too much generosity, yet fate patiently recorded every proud step she took in childhood, waiting for the day when it would turn that same pride into the heaviest mourning. Niobe, who grew up on the cool slopes of Sipylus, had of course known that one day she would leave her father's palace and that her fate would unfold in another city. But in her eyes, that journey to Thebes carried a meaning far greater than an ordinary bridal procession. As she left the fertile lands of Lydia behind, she carried with her not only her childhood, but also the shadow of Tantalus, the first pride her lineage had given her, and that old feeling that set her apart from everyone else. All along the long road, while the sound of horses' hooves, the whispers of servants, and the dust in the wind blended together, Niobe thought about the life opening before her with the cool composure of a queen. She believed that she was not going to her new home merely to become a wife. In her own mind, this journey meant the union of two great bloodlines and the carrying of her splendor onto a new stage. Even before she saw the walls of Thebes rising in the distance, she sensed that one day that city would become a mirror reflecting her own magnificence. Her arrival in Thebes truly did not feel like the beginning of an ordinary marriage. The order that welcomed her resembled not so much a princess entering her new palace as a ceremonial union binding the destinies of two powerful dynasties together. Niobe carried the heavy nobility she brought as the granddaughter of Atlas and the daughter of Tantalus upon her shoulders, while Amphion stood before her not only as a king, but as a ruler who carried the blood of Zeus. This marriage was seen not merely as the coming together of two people, but as the gathering of two legendary lines beneath a single roof. Even the elderly advisors, nobles, and priests in the palace placed upon this union a meaning that was not only familial, but fated. Niobe, meanwhile, received the respect shown to her not with humility, but as something rightfully earned. In her eyes, Thebes was not honoring her with its welcome. On the contrary, it was receiving the woman it had been waiting for in order to rise higher. The moment she began to think this way, the voice of pride began to grow within her as much as the warmth of marriage did. But what shook Niobe most was the extraordinary power echoing through the stones of Thebes. In her first days after arriving in the city, when the young queen saw the lyre in Amphion's hands, she understood that it was not merely a poet's instrument. It was a magical lyre given to him by Hermes, one whose sound commanded even lifeless matter. Every time Amphion touched the strings with his fingers, the melodies spread through the air not only as music, but almost like a command. Great masses of stone torn from the mountain slopes stirred with an obedience no human strength could ever have achieved, moved forward as though gliding through the air with their heavy bodies, and settled into place as if guided by invisible master builders. Niobe watched that sight in awe for a long time. The fact that the stones bowed to the rhythm of music and turned into walls made her think only one thing: this man was no ordinary mortal. To have a husband whom even nature obeyed lifted her own sense of greatness to an even higher place. As the days passed, the city rose higher, and as the walls were completed, Thebes gained a sense of security unlike that of any other city. This glorious seven-gated city was surrounded not only by stone walls, but by an idea of power that had become a legend. When people looked at Thebes, they no longer saw merely the rule of a king, they saw the earthly order of divine favor. As Niobe watched the city from the palace courtyards, the colonnaded corridors, and the high terraces, that same feeling deepened more and more within her. In her eyes, this city was protected not only by soldiers or thick walls, but by an invisible privilege. The walls raised by Amphion's lyre did not merely give her a sense of safety, they gave her a sense of inviolability. She began to believe that no disaster could approach this city, and that even if one did, it would be driven back. For Niobe, the rise of Thebes was less a sign of state power than a confirmation of her own personal destiny. Here she saw one of the first great signs that convinced her her life had moved beyond the ordinary line of mortal existence. Life inside the palace fed that feeling a little more each day. The old splendor left behind by Cadmus reached a new brilliance through Amphion's art and rule. The halls held cloth embroidered with gold, bronze mirrors, finely worked vessels, and gifts brought from distant lands, while every sound echoing through the corridors reminded all who heard it of the greatness of the order reigning there. Niobe had already felt privileged in her childhood days on Sipylus, but in Thebes, that feeling took material form. She was no longer only a king's daughter, but a queen standing at the center of a magnificent city. The palace servants shrank beneath her gaze. The nobles chose their words carefully when they spoke, and the people saw her not merely as the ruler's wife, but as an example of unreachable nobility. Niobe absorbed all of this in silence. After a while, every column, every piece of marble, and every echo in the palace seemed to whisper the same sentence to her: "You stood above all others." That constant refrain turned into the most dangerous song, one that slowly wore away the limits within her soul. Amphion's presence did not soften this feeling in Niobe. On the contrary, it strengthened it even more. She saw again and again that her husband was not merely a graceful poet, but a powerful ruler of divine lineage. Compared with the brute force of his brother Cynthus, Amphion's way of ruling through music seemed to Niobe more exalted, more refined, more divine. To have married a man who commanded nature not with a sword but with melody was, in her eyes, proof of her own distinction. Just as the stones of Thebes moved from place to place under Amphion's lyre, Niobe began to believe that fate itself had been arranged for her. As the city's prosperity grew, the streets filled, the markets became richer, and the palace shone each day with new splendor. The young queen saw all of this not as a shared success, but as a natural part of her own destiny. She no longer regarded happiness as a gift, but as her right. It was here that the quietest transformation took place. Niobe stopped thinking that fortune stood beside her, and began to believe that fortune belonged to her. So the years in Thebes did not merely preserve the old pride within Niobe. They enlarged it and hardened it through solid walls, magnificent ceremonies, and a marriage touched by the divine. The sense of superiority she had once carried as an idea in Sipylus took on flesh and bone here. Now she had a people looking upon her in admiration, a husband at her side who seemed almost like a demigod, and around her a city raised by music. When so many signs gathered together, Niobe did not take any of them for coincidence. On the contrary, she interpreted all this splendor as proof of her own superior nature. For her, Thebes was not merely the place where she lived, but the stone-shaped form of her own greatness. When she looked from the palace balcony toward the walls, she did not see only a protected city. She saw her own inviolability. That was why her journey to Thebes as a bride did not become merely a new beginning in Niobe's life. In those days, what grew unnoticed was not only the happiness of a queen, but also the foundation of a disaster. After the seven-gated walls of Thebes rose, and the city began to be spoken of as a miracle shaped by Amphion's lyre, Niobe's life also expanded with dazzling abundance. The marble corridors of the palace no longer carried only the footsteps of servants or the echoes of feasts. The rooms, courtyards, and terraces overflowed with the laughter of children. Niobe gave birth, one after another, to 7 sons and 7 daughters, and she began to see this great family not merely as a blessing, but as the clearest proof of her own greatness. Each new birth did more than nourish the joy of motherhood within her. It also made the pride that had been growing in her for years more visible. When she looked into the mirror, she no longer saw only a beautiful and noble queen. She saw a chosen mother upon whom fate had generously bestowed the fertility it had denied to other women. In her eyes, those 14 children were not the joy of an ordinary family. Each one stood as a living sign of how powerful, how fruitful, and how privileged her own bloodline was. As her sons grew, Niobe's way of looking at them changed even more. She no longer saw them only as children she loved, but as dynastic pillars stretching into the future. A different kind of strength shone in each of them. One stood tall on horseback, one distinguished himself with his agility during the hunt, and one, though still young, carried in his words a seriousness that already leaned toward rule. When they stepped into the courtyard, Niobe watched the breadth of their shoulders, the confidence in their stride, and the vivid fire in their eyes, and deep within, she felt an unshakable sense of security. In her eyes, those 7 young men were not only the future princes of Thebes, they were living seals that would carry her name through time. It seemed as though their father Amphion's nobility and their mother's proud roots had joined together in them. That was why, each time Niobe saw her sons, she believed even more firmly that her dynasty would not be cut off, that her house would never stand empty, and that her power would not fade with time. Their existence gave her a sense of continuity that seemed to reach beyond the limits of human life. Her daughters embodied an entirely different kind of splendor within the palace. While her sons represented the power and motion of the outer world, her daughters brought grace, measure, and nobility into the inner spaces. In their faces, Niobe saw the radiance of her own youth, even a finer echo of her own beauty. One had a gentle smile, one had a voice as clear as crystal, and in another's walk there was an almost divine calm. When they played the lyre, embroidered, or stood with dignified composure beside their mother during ceremonies, the leading figures of Thebes could not help but think that these girls were no ordinary princesses. To Niobe, those 7 daughters were not only children to whom she was bound by love, they were mirrors that made the refinement and superiority of her line visible. She began to read in their faces the alliances that would one day be formed, the marriages that would be made, and the fame that would spread outward. By then, her motherhood and her pride had become entangled. The grace of her daughters stirred in her less gratitude than a growing urge to compare herself with other women. It was during those same years that a silent yet poisonous comparison began to take root in Niobe's mind. Leto, whom she had known since childhood, was no longer merely a name left behind in the past. She had become a measure standing on the far shore of the superiority Niobe nurtured within herself. Surrounded by 7 sons and 7 daughters of her own, Niobe found it almost unfair to think that Leto had only 2 children. At first, the thought passed only through her mind, but over time it hardened and became belief. Niobe convinced herself that greater numbers also proved greater divine worth. The fact that a goddess was remembered for 2 children, while she herself stood surrounded by 14, seemed to her an open sign of superiority. That comparison unsettled her inner sense of measure more than anything else. She no longer thought of her children only because she loved them, but also because they made her rise above someone else. Whenever Leto's name entered her mind, the number of her own children immediately arranged itself before her eyes, and that living multitude filled her with a sense of invisible triumph. When the people of Thebes looked toward the palace, it truly was hard for them not to feel admiration. Everywhere in the city, people spoke of Niobe's children, and the strength of the sons and the beauty of the daughters were praised as examples. During festivals, ceremonies, and palace banquets, those 14 young people gathered around the queen were seen as the brightest face of Thebes' prosperity and order. Yet beneath that admiration, a growing unease also stirred. The people sensed that Niobe's joy in motherhood had begun to change. She no longer looked like a mother who approached her children with love, but like a queen who carried them as a procession, proclaiming her own invincibility. People applauded her and tried to please her by praising her children, yet at the same time they turned their heads and spoke in low voices about how the gods would answer such open pride. At times, the look on Niobe's face sharpened so much that the people felt she no longer wanted devotion directed toward her children, but toward herself through them. That was why love and fear grew together in the streets of Thebes. Niobe, however, misread the silent unease around her. She took people's hesitation for admiration and their caution for the natural extension of respect. With each passing day, she turned the existence of her children more and more into proof of her own superiority. She no longer saw them as gifts fate had placed in her hands, but as signs confirming her greatness. When she thought about the future, she imagined her sons growing stronger in rule, her daughters carrying light into other dynasties through brilliant marriages, and her grandchildren filling the palace of Thebes with even greater numbers. In this way, the happiness she possessed ceased to seem like a fragile blessing and became, in her eyes, a dependable armor. Even when she thought of the losses, sudden disasters, and blows of fate that struck other people, she began to imagine herself outside their reach. It was as though her abundance, her strength, and her bloodline had set her apart from the destiny of ordinary people. Quietly, a belief settled within her. Fate might test everyone, but it could not truly destroy her. The most dangerous thought that drew Niobe closer to disaster was precisely that sense of unshakability. So the radiant period that unfolded within the palace of Thebes did not remain only the greatest happiness of a mother. It also rose like a monument destined to fall. As Niobe walked among 7 sons and 7 daughters, she believed she had climbed to the highest step in life. In her sons, she saw the strength of her bloodline. In her daughters, the continuation of her own beauty and nobility. And when she looked at them all together, she believed her name had become almost untouchable. That was why maternal love could not remain pure tenderness in her heart. Joy mingled with pride. Pride fed comparison, and from comparison came arrogance, all of it binding itself together before anyone noticed. Niobe truly was happy in those days, yet instead of protecting her happiness, she used it to place herself above all measure. Looking back, one could say that disaster had already begun then, for the thing a person stood to lose most was often the very thing that seemed safest. Niobe came to believe in those very days that she stood above the blows of fate, and for that exact reason, fate began to prepare its harshest answer for her. In those days, Thebes looked unshakable from the outside. The walls that had risen with the echo of Amphion's lyre, the wealth-filled squares, and the joy that multiplied in the marble courtyards of the palace had given the city an almost sacred sense of confidence. Yet beneath that visible peace, a thin and cold crack had begun to grow. The first person to feel it was Manto, the daughter of the blind sage Tiresias. This young woman, who lived by the intuition she inherited from her father, noticed the change in the air the moment she woke one morning. The sun rose from the same place again, and the wind passed through the same streets again, but the invisible weight that settled over the city was entirely different. Manto understood that this was not the fear of war or famine. It was something quieter, but more terrifying. the wounded silence of divine order. In recent years, Niobe's growing pride had ceased to be only a flaw of character and had turned into a challenge that rose all the way to the heavens. Manto saw the first shadow of the coming disaster at that very moment. With that intuition, she stepped into the streets without losing time. She began calling the women of Thebes to the squares, the roads to the temples, and the altars. Her voice sounded neither merely like the voice of a priestess nor like an ordinary warning. It was as if an unseen power spoke through her tongue. She asked for offerings to be prepared in Leto's name, for laurel branches to be gathered, for incense to be burned, and for prayers to rise to the heavens without delay. In her mind, the city could soften the approaching wrath only if it bowed in respect. Manto's call spread through all of Thebes in a short time. Women brought sacred vessels, oils, and flowers from their homes. Some placed wreaths on their heads, while others took their children with them and came down to the square to pray. A pious urgency suddenly began in the city. Everyone knew the source of the danger, even if no one spoke its name openly. Their queen's arrogance no longer echoed only within the palace walls. It grew like a shadow that threatened the fate of the entire city. For that reason, the preparations were not only an act of worship, but also an effort to calm what was coming. The air in the square grew more sacred and more tense. Incense smoke rose before the altars, and the prayers that fell from the women's lips gently carried Leto's name to the heavens. The women, crowned with laurel wreaths, seemed to want to honor the goddess's dignity as a mother and keep the anger of her children, Apollo and Artemis, away from them. For the first time, the city felt openly ashamed before an unseen power. Standing in the middle of the crowd and watching the echo of her words, Manto perhaps still held on to a small hope. Perhaps Thebes would bow in time. Perhaps Niobe would fall silent. Perhaps this ritual would scatter the ominous weight pressing down on the city. But fate changed direction at exactly such moments. While a human crowd prepared to retreat in fear, disaster often kept resisting in the pride of a single person. The same thing happened that day in the square of Thebes. The women had turned toward prayer, and the city wanted to calm the unseen wrath. Yet all of that sacred preparation stood in a balance so fragile that even a single glance could shatter it. The person who broke that balance was Niobe. When the queen descended into the square with her attendants, the air changed at once. Her magnificent garments, the upright carriage of her head, and the hard confidence she cast around her turned her into an almost unreachable being in the eyes of the people. But that day, there was not mercy within that splendor, but contempt. As Niobe watched the women turn toward the altar, she did not see it as the natural expression of faith. On the contrary, she took the sight of Thebes turning toward an unseen goddess before her very eyes as a personal insult. In her mind, the city owed its walls, its wealth, and the glory of its dynasty to her. In such a place, for women to offer incense to Leto meant turning away from visible magnificence and bowing to an uncertain shadow. She was in no state of mind to understand the smoke, the prayer, or the fear in the square. The hard feeling that had long kept her from seeing herself as beneath the gods now prepared, for the first time, to spill out openly. The expression on the queen's face carried not only anger, but also a pride that had become difficult to turn back from. Niobe stood among the women, and her voice sharply tore through the sacred silence of the square. She questioned why people showed greater respect to a goddess they had only heard of than to a queen they saw with their own eyes. Then, as always, she turned the matter to her own superiority. She spoke of her lineage. She reminded them that she was the daughter of Tantalus, that she was counted as a granddaughter of Atlas, and that she carried a bloodline that reached to Zeus. She sincerely believed that this nobility had given her a place far above ordinary mortals. Then she listed the wealth of Thebes, the splendor of the palace, the magical power of Amphion, and the magnificence that surrounded her. But her final and strongest proof was once again her children. With 7 sons and 7 daughters, she asked in contempt why offerings were arranged in honor of a goddess like Leto, who had only 2 children. In her mind, number had turned into proof of abundance, and abundance into proof of superiority. In that way, Niobe began to speak even of her motherhood, not in the language of gratitude, but in the language of comparison and contempt. That was the exact moment when the dangerous threshold was crossed. The women listened to these words in fear. Manto's warning was still fresh in their ears, but their queen's anger stood just as close. None of them dared to object openly. The incense in their hands grew heavy, and the laurel wreaths suddenly rested on their heads like a meaningless burden. As Niobe's command grew harsher, the crowd quietly stepped back. Some lowered their heads and left the side of the altar, some stopped their prayers halfway, and some removed their wreaths without saying anything out of fear. On the surface, Niobe had won. The square fell silent at her word. The worship directed toward Leto was cut short, and Manto's call seemed broken. But in truth, what fell silent there was not the faith of the people, but only their voice. As the women retreated, they did not take their fears away with them. On the contrary, an even heavier silence settled over Thebes. Everyone felt that their queen had crossed the unseen boundary. This was not merely the breaking of a ritual. It was the open humiliation before the eyes of the people of the respect that should have been shown to divine order. After that moment, even though the ritual had stopped, the path to disaster had opened. As Niobe left the square, however, she failed to grasp its true meaning. She took the women's retreat as acceptance of her greatness. She mistook the silence not as a sign of fear, but of submission. Yet Manto's prophecy that day did not remain a warning that was heard and forgotten. It turned into the last chance that was rejected. Before this, Niobe had compared herself to Leto in her own mind, and had taken pride in her lineage and her children. But all of that had remained at the level of thought. That day, for the first time, her pride turned into a public command and into an open stance against divine order. Thebes was no longer only a city ruled by a powerful queen. It had turned into a stage watched closely by the gods. Niobe still thought it was victory, but fate often moved forward, not with the loudest sound, but after silences exactly like this one. Manto's warning had been rejected, the respect due to Leto had been belittled, and the first door that was difficult to close again had been opened. That day, Thebes did not shift from its place, the heavens did not split, and no stones fell. Even so, a new age had begun, one that everyone entered without realizing it. Pride was no longer a thought, but destiny. The marble square of Thebes shone white beneath the sun that day, and the heat rising from the stones made the city quiver like a heavy mirage. While the unease that had moved among the women gathered to make offerings to Leto had not yet faded, Niobe descended the high steps of the square with her retinue. Her splendid garments, her gold-embroidered cloak, and the hard dignity that kept her head held high made her seem, in the eyes of the people, not merely a queen, but almost an untouchable being. There was no hesitation in her walk. She seemed to have come to that square not to argue, but to declare her judgment. The laurel wreaths the women had removed from their heads still lay scattered across the stones, and the scent of incense still lingered in the air like a thin line. When Niobe looked upon that scene, she did not see holiness. She saw respect that had not been directed toward her. In that very moment, the scornful expression that appeared on her face became the true herald of the coming disaster. She no longer seemed merely like a ruler who had been offended, but like someone who had openly decided to settle accounts with an unseen goddess. When the square fell into silence, Niobe lifted her head and began to speak in a tone that scolded her people. She asked the people of Thebes why they showed greater reverence to a goddess whose name merely passed from tongue to tongue than to the queen they had seen with their own eyes. For her, the matter was no longer about a ritual or the summons of priestesses. It had become a struggle for supremacy between visible splendor and invisible holiness. She openly belittled Leto. She made her seem like nothing more than a name spoken in the distance, a vague mother living in old stories. By contrast, she presented her own presence as a solid power standing in the very center of the square, touching the stones, the walls, and the people. In Niobe's eyes, the true glory of Thebes had stood not in the heavens, but right beside them. That was why the sight of her people lifting their hands in prayer to an unseen power had seemed like foolishness to her. As she spoke, her voice echoed through the columns, yet the true weight of her words had rested in the arrogance they carried. Each sentence became another hard step cast toward the divine order. Then Niobe began to list everything that made her superior, as if each thing were proof. She reminded them that she was the daughter of Tantalus, and she stressed that she carried the blood of that privileged mortal who had sat at the table of the gods. She traced her lineage back to Atlas and Zeus, speaking as though the ancient power flowing through her veins was enough to place her far above ordinary mortals. Then she spoke of Amphion. She believed that having such a mighty husband, the man who had raised the walls of Thebes and bent even stones to his will through music, proved how exalted her fate had been. She pointed to the city. She indicated its walls, its palace, its wealth, and the people who bowed before her. She sincerely believed that all that grandeur should have outweighed Leto's vague holiness. The more she spoke, the harsher her voice became, and the more her self-assurance swelled. In that moment, Niobe spoke not merely like the queen of Thebes, but like a proud ruler who believed that she herself should have been worshipped on earth. That was why her words ceased to be a defense and became an open challenge. Yet the most poisonous part of Niobe's speech emerged when she spoke of her children. She spoke of her 7 sons and 7 daughters with such pride that she seemed to believe their number alone was enough to establish a divine judgment. She reminded them that Leto had only 2 children. She diminished that number, almost erased it, and measured superiority in motherhood directly by abundance. She regarded her own fertility as more than a blessing. She treated it as a victory, while she saw Leto's motherhood as lacking and insufficient. At the sound of those words from their queen, the women in the square lowered their heads even further, because everyone felt how ominous it was for one mother to humiliate another through her children. Niobe, however, did not notice. To her, 14 children were a mark of superiority that not even the sky could deny. In that moment, a mother's love on her lips ceased to be the language of gratitude and turned into a weapon of superiority. Thus, in the middle of the square, Niobe wounded not only Leto, but also the motherhood that represented Leto's honor. As her words continued, Niobe did not understand that she was sealing her own disaster with her own mouth. The feeling that she stood above even the blows of fate was no longer merely a thought moving within her. It had gained a voice and spilled out before the people in the middle of the square. She believed that no matter how harshly fate struck, what remained in her hands would still be greater than what others possessed. She had trusted so deeply in her lineage, her husband, her city, and the number of her children that she forgot the basic truth of being mortal. That was where the true tragedy deepened. Niobe began to see what she possessed, not as fragile blessings she ought to have protected, but as deserved triumphs she could put forward against the gods. She interpreted the silence of the people not as a hush born of fear, but as acceptance of her superiority. Yet the silence gathering in the square was the silence of an unseen terror. No one opposed her, because everyone felt that her words had gone too far to be taken back. Niobe, by contrast, believed she had won a victory. One by one, the women withdrew from the altar, the incense died out, and the prayers retreated behind their lips. Niobe saw that as the final judgment of her will over the square, and as she turned back up the marble steps, she seemed to grow with every step she took. Yet the side that appeared to have won had actually reached the threshold of punishment. For every sentence that had belittled Leto, exalted her own bloodline and city, and turned the number of her children into an insult against the goddess's motherhood, had directly called down divine vengeance. This was no longer merely pride. It had become an act of insolence spoken aloud and declared before everyone. Thebes seemed the same city, the square seemed the same square, and the sky seemed the same sky, yet something in the unseen balance had broken. As Niobe returned to her palace, she still believed herself invincible, yet on that very day, in that very square, she opened with her own hand the door that prepared her fall. The words with which she had defied the goddess did not vanish into the air. They rose to the heavens and took their place like a dark sign pointing the way to punishment. As Niobe walked along the high terraces of the palace of Thebes, she did not know how her words had risen to the sky. But in the unseen realm, that challenge had already found its answer. Within the sacred silence of Delos, on the windswept slopes of Mount Cynthus, Leto's honor had begun to ache like a deep wound. Once driven from place to place, forced to struggle even to find a safe piece of land where she could bring her children into the world, this goddess had known better than anyone how fragile and how sacred motherhood was. That was why Niobe's words, spoken in the middle of a crowded square and meant to humiliate not only her, but her motherhood as well, had not felt like an ordinary insult to her. As Leto stood among the hard stones of Delos, she felt as though she had heard the pains of her own past all over again. Her anger did not grow as a sudden cry, but within a more terrifying silence, for her fury ran far deeper than the hurt caused by a mortal's empty pride. It was a heavy and cold response, rising from within against the humiliation of divine order itself. At those hours, Delos had looked calm from the outside. The sun had rested with a soft glow over the waters of the Aegean, and the rocks of Cynthus had darkened like bronze in the evening light. Yet within that calm appearance, a tense waiting had taken hold. Higher up the mountain, at a point that looked over both sky and sea at once, Leto stood and seemed to pick out the invisible echo coming from Thebes through the wind itself. It was as though Niobe's words had reached her ears. The scorn of a mother who had boasted of her lineage, her wealth, her city, and her 14 children had tried to make Leto's 2 children seem worthless. The goddess had not been one to leave such an insult unanswered, but her anger had not been hasty. She had not lashed out in rage as mortals did. On the contrary, the clearer her decision became, the calmer her bearing grew. For a moment, even the stones of Delos, the blue of the sky, and the distant line of the sea seemed to join in her silence. For the answer that would be given now would not be the answer of a mother alone. The measured yet inevitable response of heavenly order to human arrogance had begun. Then Leto called for her children. This call had not been a summons made in a loud voice. It carried neither lament nor plea. It rose to the sky more like a will that came from the honor of motherhood itself and could not be resisted. The moment Apollo and Artemis heard that call, they came to their mother's side. They looked clear, silent, and sure of themselves, like silver light. When Leto looked at their faces, she saw that her own pain had turned within them not into anger, but into sharp resolve. In Apollo's gaze there was a certainty that found distant targets without ever missing. In Artemis's silence there was a will as cold, clean, and hard as the night of the forest. As their mother told them Niobe's words, she did not speak at length. There had been no need for that. What the insult was, how the boundary had been crossed, and why the answer should not be delayed, had already been understood within the very presence of the twins. In that moment, an understanding beyond the reach of human language was formed between the 3 of them. No oath was shouted, and no rage was put on display. Yet the decision made on the summit of Cynthus had weighed more heavily than the walls of Thebes. Apollo and Artemis saw this attack against their mother's honor not as a personal wound, but as a response that had to be given against the disruption of order. That was why their silence had been so frightening. A mortal would shout, threaten, and then hesitate. But when divine beings made a decision, words became unnecessary. When Apollo took his silver bow in hand, there was neither anger nor haste on his face. Artemis made her own preparations with the same calm control. What stood upon her was not the lightness of youth, but the certainty of a hunter who already knew the fate of the prey. As Leto watched her children in this state, the anger within her ceased to be a scattered pain. It took shape, found direction, and turned into a silent vengeance. While a queen in Thebes believed herself invincible, 2 divine archers in Delos were setting out to defend their mother's wounded honor. There was no display in this preparation. For that very reason, everything was more terrifying. For noise was often the refuge of the weak. Real power, as it approached, silenced the air, made time heavier, and drew fate irreversibly in its own direction. At that moment, an invisible bond was formed between Thebes and Delos. On one side stood Niobe, seated proudly in her marble palace. On the other stood Leto and her children upon the bare stones of Mount Cynthus. One had trusted in her multitude, the other would not forget the insult done to what was sacred. One had counted her children as if they were marks of superiority, the other saw in the existence of her 2 children an untouchable honor. Seen on a heavenly scale, this was no longer a comparison between 2 mothers. The matter concerned the human daring to raise itself above its own limits. The sense of invulnerability that Niobe had built in Thebes had been an illusion woven from walls, wealth, and the number of her children. The answer rising in Delos, however, was a silent, plain, and certain power. As the wind changed direction, it seemed as though the coldness of that decision had begun to move even over the Aegean. The people of Thebes still knew nothing. Palace servants continued their daily tasks, and the squares were preparing for the coolness of evening. But on the unseen plain, disaster had ceased to be a thought and had already set out on its way. That moment of decision on Mount Cynthus became the true beginning of the tragedy, for it was here that divine response first took shape. Once Leto's hurt joined with the silent preparation of Apollo and Artemis, the disaster that would fall upon Thebes became unavoidable. The sky looked normal that evening. The stars would rise on time, and the sea would strike the shore in the same rhythm. Yet on the delicate scale of the universe, a weight had shifted. Niobe's pride had not remained mere words. It had turned into an offense that found its answer on the stones of Cynthus. The wind blowing across Delos grew harsher, as though it had taken upon its wings a mother's wounded pride and the unwavering will of her two divine children. What was drawing near to Thebes was not punishment alone. It was the movement of an invisible justice. Niobe did not know this yet. Perhaps she was still thinking of her children's future, the safety of her city, and her own superiority. Yet at those same hours, the decision had been made on a heavenly scale. Upon the place where human arrogance had risen, an answer born from divine silence would descend. While the day still looked bright and secure behind the seven-gated walls of Thebes, the slopes of Kithairon, stretching far beyond the city, carried a different kind of silence that morning. Niobe's 7 sons had gone out to hunt with the wild energy of youth and the unshakable confidence their bloodline gave them. Their horses' necks gleamed in the light, their reins curved in skilled hands, and their cheerful voices echoed across the rocky slopes. Ismenus rode in front. Behind him, Sipylus, Phaedamus, Tantalus, Alphanor, Damasichthon, and Ilioneus spread across the foothills in a wide arc. For them, this was not only a morning hunt. Each one, raised as a prince in the palace of Thebes, believed that even if danger came near, it would still retreat before him. The sense of untouchability their mother had fed for years had also worked its way into her sons' veins. As Niobe saw them off from the palace's high terrace, she saw the presence of her 7 sons as the firmest support of her own power, and once again she believed in her heart that these young bodies were pillars that would never break. In the eyes of the young princes, the paths of Kithairon did not look like a threat, but like a field of play. The shoulders they held upright on horseback, the commanding signals they gave to the hunting dogs, and the confident glances they threw at one another all showed that they still saw the world from an age that had never known loss. Ismenus set the direction of the hunt. Sipylus picked out distant movement with sharp eyes, and the others spread out as if each wanted to display his own skill to the rest. As the sun rose higher above them, they believed that the splendid life of Thebes still surrounded them there as well. For when a person lived under protection for too long, he began to mistake protection for the natural state of fate itself. Niobe's sons were exactly like that. Their father's power, their mother's pride, and the sense of superiority they had learned in the palace created in them the feeling of an invisible armor. Not one of them knew the silent judgment moving above their heads. Not one of them sensed that their mother's words had turned into targets marked with their own names along those mountain paths. Toward noon, the air of the mountain suddenly changed. The birds grew quieter, the dogs became restless for no reason, and even the wind seemed to forget its direction for a moment. The strange silence shook the young prince's joy slightly, but none of them understood the real danger. For disaster sometimes came not first with noise, but with the moment when everything fell too silent. At that very moment, Apollo watched them from an unseen height. He had drawn his silver bow and carried his anger not with a shout, but with flawless cold control. Niobe's words in the square had now turned in his hand into a command as certain as death. The first arrow flew toward Ismenus without giving any warning. The young prince only heard the thin sound cutting through the air. Then his body jolted backward, the reins slipped from his hand, and he collapsed heavily over his horse's neck. At first, his brothers could not understand what had happened. For a moment, they all thought it had been a tragic accident, but that single fall was the first sign of the destruction descending over the mountain. As Ismenus slipped from his horse, the confidence in his brothers' faces shattered at once. Sipylus pulled hard on the reins and turned his eyes to the sky and the slopes, but he could not find where the enemy stood. There was no man before them to fight, no spear to hide from, no approaching troop of riders. That was the heaviest form of fear, death whose source could not be seen. Sipylus thought of fleeing. He wheeled his horse and drove it toward a narrow pass. But Apollo's arrow moved faster than he did. Just as the young prince believed he could escape, the second strike silenced him and threw his body onto the stony ground. Then the scattered brothers were no longer hunters, but stunned prey. Phaedymus and Tantalus stayed near each other and tried to find direction. Alphenor tried to gather them together. Damasichthon tried to take shelter behind a rock, and the youngest, Ilioneus, understood for the first time how great the horror truly was. But the mountain did not protect them. Kithairon, which only a short while earlier had been filled with the voices of youth, now turned into the silent stage of a divine execution. Apollo's blows were not hurried. On the contrary, they carried a terrifying order. As each arrow struck a body, it tore away another piece of the male line in which Niobe had placed so much trust. When Phaedymus and Tantalus fell side by side, even brotherhood ceased to be a refuge. When Alphenor ran to the ones who had collapsed and tried to lift them, he saw that even mercy itself had become a target. He too was pulled into the same fate. Damasichthon wavered between fleeing and fighting, but neither his speed nor his courage could save him from the unseen archer. With each fall, the silence of Kithairon grew heavier. The strength of those young bodies, their training, their princely rank, and the name of the bloodline they carried meant nothing. The names Niobe had once counted with pride were now being laid one by one upon the stones of the mountain. That was where the true horror of divine punishment lay. It left no space to resist. As the sons fell one by one, the idea of invincibility their mother had built for years also broke apart a little more with every arrow. At last, only a few breaths of hope remained. When Ilioneus saw the silence scattered around his brothers, he felt the reckless confidence of youth collapse completely within him. The boy who had laughed on horseback that very morning now looked up at the sky with his knees giving way beneath him. He did not try to flee because he understood that flight too would be useless. When he raised his arms and called out to the unseen power, the plea rose not only for his own life, but for an entire house falling into ruin. But Apollo's judgment did not change. When Niobe's pride reached into the safest ground of motherhood, the door to mercy also closed. When the last sun fell, no joy from the hunt remained on Kithairon. The horses moved away in fear, the dogs sank into a whimpering silence, and although the sun still stood at the same height, the day seemed to darken all at once. The male future of the House of Thebes was left in the mountain soil within a single noon hour. It would have been wrong to say that Niobe was not in the palace while all this happened. She stood far from the disaster, yet still within its shadow. As she walked along the marble terrace or through the wide halls, she took the return of her sons for something as natural as victory itself. Perhaps she thought about what animals they would bring back from the hunt, or which son would look swifter than the others. The silence on Kithairon had not yet fully reached the palace. No messenger had yet set out, no scream had struck the walls, and the first certain words that would pierce a mother's heart had not yet been spoken. That was how the first great blow of the tragedy began. Niobe's pride broke first, not before her eyes, but far from them. The queen, who counted her 7 sons as the strongest pillars of her untouchability, still did not know that those pillars had already been laid upon the earth that very day. But fate had already changed direction. The silent destruction that began on Kithairon had started to descend toward Thebes on the mountain wind, and the palace, still unable to recognize the darkness coming toward its own gate, did nothing but wait. The disaster that had begun on the slopes of Kithairon did not first slip into the palace like a scream, but like the heavy steps of terrible news. In the magnificent palace of Thebes, everything still seemed to stand in its proper place from the outside at that hour. The columns stood tall, the servants moved about in whispers, and the daylight spread through the high-ceilinged halls like pale gold. But before the surface of that order broke, the air itself had changed. Niobe had felt that change at once, even before she could name it. The confident sense of waiting she had carried when she sent her sons out to hunt had given way, before noon arrived, to a dread she could not describe. Then hurried footsteps sounded near the outer gates of the palace. The sounds multiplied, fell silent, and rose again. No one dared speak openly. The news first appeared in people's eyes, then on trembling lips, and then took shape in the breath that caught in the throat of a messenger who came running. The moment the first broken sentence about the fate of the 7 young princes entered the palace air, the first great crack opened in the life Niobe had believed for years to be as solid as stone. The messenger's words were incomplete, fragmented, and full of fear, but even their broken form did nothing to soften the truth. A catastrophe had struck on Kithairon. The princes were not returning. The horses had scattered. The sounds of the hunt had fallen silent, and the bodies of the young masters had lain across the rocky slopes. As those words fell into the heart of the palace, Niobe first wanted to reject them. This stood against the order of the world she had built. Such a great loss should not have been possible in her own house. For many years she had believed that fate might knock at the doors of other people, but would pause at hers. Now that belief began to unravel with the trembling voice of the messenger. The hard expression of a queen still seemed to hold on her face for a moment. She kept her shoulders straight, asked questions, demanded details, and wished the news had been a mistake. But as the names of her 7 sons were spoken one by one, She understood for the first time that this was not an error, but a real blow aimed at her. In that moment, the heart of a mother that had long been hidden beneath her pride was shaken beyond repair. After that moment, the palace's marble corridors changed as well. Those long passageways that had, until the day before, carried a feeling of safety, wealth, and order now turned into suffocating tunnels that caught every sound and made it larger. Footsteps grew harder. Every whisper coming from afar echoed like news of some new disaster, and even the air coming through the open windows carried a chill instead of relief. As Niobe walked from one hall to another, she could not find the sense of belonging she had once felt in those same spaces. It was as if the walls of the palace no longer protected her, but instead trapped the pain inside and multiplied it. Every column, every curtain, every bronze door knocker reminded her again of the truth she had just heard. Her sons would not return. The order that came with being part of a royal house was not enough to restore the shattered inner world of a mother. As a queen raised to stand upright before all people, she knew she should not retreat. But the instinct of motherhood weakened her until she could barely cling to the cold surfaces of the marble. For the first time, the palace no longer looked like a place of rule, but like a chamber of mourning where the echo never died. The daughters understood this change before their mother put it into words, sensing it not through language, but through the air itself. Those young girls, raised in their father's palace and familiar with every turn of its corridors, suddenly noticed the fear hidden in the servants' faces and the strange hardness in their mother's expression. At first they did not fully grasp what had happened, but the panic of people running through the palace, the names spoken in whispers, and the voices of women trying to hold back tears pulled them into a growing terror. One called out the names of her brothers one by one. Another tried to comfort herself by saying, "They will come back." And another moved closer to Niobe's robe, searching her face for reassurance. But the queen's eyes no longer held the unshakable authority they had always known. When the daughters saw this crack in their mother, the fear in the palace only deepened. They gathered in one room and pressed close to one another, looked out through the windows and waited for news, and flinched at every new footstep. Within only a few hours, the inside of the palace had ceased to feel like a home filled with children's laughter, and had become a place of waiting, where every breath tightened in the chest. For Niobe, the heaviest burden in those moments was the collision of two different identities within her. One part of her still remained the Queen of Thebes. She had to control the news, gather the truth, keep panic from spreading through the palace, and not collapse before her daughters. She tried to compose her face, keep her voice calm, and give clear orders to the servants. She had the messengers questioned again, sent men outside, and struggled to hold together the order that had begun to fall apart in the palace. But the other part of her was a mother who could no longer fully sustain any of those actions. Every time she gave an order, the childlike faces of her 7 sons rose in her mind. Every time she spoke a strong sentence, that sentence seemed to break apart as it left her. Queenship commanded her to stand tall, while motherhood wanted her to fall to her knees and cry out. That was why Niobe, for the first time, split within herself. Before, strength and pride had met in the same place. Now strength remained only as duty, while pride gave way to horror. In that moment, the crown and a mother's heart became enemies for the first time. As evening settled over the palace, The news was no longer only a rumor, but an irreversible truth. The absence of her 7 sons had sunk into the stones of Thebes, yet this destruction was not complete, and had only opened the door. Niobe could not fully understand that then, but she felt with certainty that the balance of the world had changed. To know that the children she had sent off in the morning would not return by evening cast all her past and all her proud words in a new light. As she walked through the palace corridors, the scornful sentences she had once hurled at Leto now echoed back into her like knives turning inward. The way her daughters drew close to her in fear called her back into the role of a mother. But she now stood in the middle of a world she could no longer protect with her former certainty. So the disaster that had begun outside finally entered within. The first arrows loosed on Kithairon had not only struck her sons, but had also pierced the entire belief in invulnerability that Niobe had built around herself. The palace still stood, and the crown still rested on her head, but the order inside Niobe had collapsed, and this was only the beginning. That first great mourning that settled over the palace had not yet been absorbed when the threshold of a second and deeper darkness opened. The news from Kithairon left a void in Niobe's heart that she had not yet known how to name, and the splendor of the marble halls suddenly turned into a cold echo. The absence of her 7 sons silenced everyone who still breathed within the palace of Thebes, but the disaster had been too determined to stop there. The daughters gathered around their mother, drew closer to one another in fear, and trembled more with every new whisper. Yet whenever Niobe looked at them, she could suppress the pain rising inside her for a moment. For after her male children, she still had her 7 daughters, who remained in her hands like the delicate light of the palace itself. Their presence seemed like the last solid part of her shattered life, but divine wrath always aimed at the final place where a human being sought refuge. That day the walls of the palace stood as silent witnesses, not only to mourning, but also to the approaching divine punishment. No one said it openly yet, but the weight in the air made it clear that the suffering of the royal house of Thebes had not yet been completed, and that the true collapse was now about to enter. The arrival of Artemis announced itself not with noise, but with a terrifying stillness. No doors were broken down, and no thunder rolled across the sky, yet the air of the palace changed all at once. Even the light filtering through the windows grew harsher, and the wind moving through the corridors carried a sacred yet merciless command. The girls felt that something was drawing near them before they ever saw it with their eyes. One hand clutched another's arm, one stepped behind her mother, one lowered her head as if she wanted to pray. In that moment, Niobe realized for the first time since the loss of her sons that she stood truly defenseless. For there was no longer any distance between the hunting ground outside and the inside of the palace. Disaster had crossed the threshold and settled in the very center of her motherhood. When Artemis began to rule within the palace through an unseen yet undeniable power, Niobe understood that this was not a mistake, not a coincidence, and not an attack that could be stopped. This was the answer of the divine order she had scorned when she challenged Leto. And that answer had turned toward the silent presence of her daughters. At that moment, Niobe forgot her queenship completely and moved only as a mother. She gathered her daughters around her, opened her arms, and tried to hide them in a circle around her own body. As if human warmth might have served as a shield against divine punishment, She tried to hold each one of them with her eyes, her voice, and her hands. The woman who had once stood upright at the glorious center of the palace had now become a desperate mother in that same palace, pulling her children to the hem of her dress and trying to protect them from an unseen power. In the eyes of the girls, there was not only fear, but also the last trust they still placed in their mother. The more Niobe saw that, the more deeply she broke apart. For all those years, she had taught them that they were the children of a powerful royal house, and she had believed that her lineage and her wealth would protect them from the blows of life. Now, neither the weight of the throne, nor the name of Amphion, nor the high walls of Thebes did any good. Even the innermost rooms of the palace were not safe. For the first time, she felt in all its nakedness that nothing she possessed was enough to save her children. Then the pleading began. This was not the measured request of a queen, but the final refuge of a mother who was collapsing. Niobe lifted her head toward the sky and was forced to speak the name of Leto, whom she had once mentioned with contempt, now in a broken voice. She spoke as though she wanted to take back her guilt, showed that she no longer had the strength to bear the weight of her pride, and begged that at least her remaining children might be spared. The motherhood she had once praised for its abundance now rose before her like evidence of a crime. Everything she had once thought with the certainty of "I am greater" turned in that moment into the cry, "Protect what I still have left." But divine punishment did not soften before the repentance a human being found at the very end. The silence of Artemis weighed more heavily than Niobe's words. In that moment, when the plea hung in the air and returned without finding any answer, everyone in the palace understood that mercy would not be called back. As Niobe felt her own voice strike stone and return to her, she understood that she was about to lose not only her children, but also the entire meaning of her motherhood. As the daughters disappeared one by one from around their mother, the world inside the palace also began to empty. The rooms that had once been filled with laughter, delicate voices, the sounds of the lyre, and youthful footsteps were now buried in a silence that would never return from loss. The fertility Niobe had boasted of for so many years ceased before her eyes to be a source of splendor and became an echoing emptiness. The feeling of superiority that had come from being surrounded by 7 sons and 7 daughters gave way to the incomprehensible weight of immeasurable loss. Abundance no longer strengthened her. On the contrary, it multiplied her suffering. With each child who was taken, every hope she had tied to them, every thought of the future, every glorious dream also vanished. The woman who had seen her own beauty in the grace of her daughters and the continuation of her bloodline in the strength of her sons could now hold on to none of it. The palace of Thebes still stood, but the house of motherhood within it had fallen. In that moment, Niobe learned that giving birth did not always mean possessing, and that the greatest blessing could sometimes turn into the deepest absence. That knowledge became the most painful lesson the gods gave her. In the end, what remained around Niobe was no longer a circle of children, but silence. She had once defined herself through the identity of a mother with many children, and she had counted that title as a measure of superiority even over a goddess. Now that same woman in that same palace felt that identity slipping from her hands. The pride she had built on the number of her children was stripped away one by one, and all that remained was the naked wound of motherhood. She still had her throne, but she had no joy left to fill it. Her name was still queen, But her heart was no longer the heart of one who ruled. It was the heart of a mother who had lost. That was why the true fall happened not after the loss of the children, but within Niobe herself. On that day, she did not lose only her daughters, she also lost the last great meaning on which she had relied when she spoke of herself. The mother who had gloried in her abundance turned in a single stroke into a mother without children, and that transformation weighed more heavily than every destruction visible from the outside. For in the final silence echoing through the palace, it became impossible to deny that divine punishment had aimed not only at bodies but also at the whole being of a woman. After the news of disaster from Kithairon settled into the palace, and after the daughters too were torn from their mother's arms by Artemis's merciless command, the destruction that descended upon the house of Thebes grew too heavy to be borne not only by a mother, but by an entire kingdom. Until that day, the walls that had risen to the sound of Amphion's lyre, the melodies that had given the city security and measure, and the voices of children drifting through the courtyards of the palace, had all suddenly faded like memories from a distant age. King Amphion, that mighty man who had once moved stones from their places with his music, could no longer bear the silence of his own house within that same palace. The absence of his children carved a wound in his soul that no words could ever reach. Niobe's disaster had begun in the square, had grown along the mountain slopes, and had been completed in the palace chambers. But the thing that truly broke the spine of the dynasty was this final blow now striking the father's heart. A kingdom had lived not only through its children, but through the invisible bond that kept the father and mother standing as they carried them. That bond was now breaking. In the first days, Amphion did not live through his ruin with cries, but with a terrifying silence. The man who had once filled every stone, every hall, and every courtyard with music now barely parted his lips, and even when he did, his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Each time the names of his sons and daughters were spoken in whispers through the palace, he lowered his head even more, as though every name drove itself into his heart again. Neither the words of those trying to comfort him reached him, nor did the duties of kingship lift him back to his feet. Being the king of Thebes seemed to him in that moment like nothing but an empty title, because the city whose walls he had raised had failed to protect his own children. Amphion felt that this was not only a declaration of the god's wrath, but also a declaration of his own helplessness. For a father, no humiliation could have been heavier than that. To remain alone with their absence without even being able to lay his children into the earth created an inward collapse within him, one in which music fell silent, will came apart, and the meaning of life drained away. As time moved on, that silence in Amphion deepened even further. Some told that he sat alone in a chamber and took his lyre into his hands, yet could not touch the strings. Others said that the same lyre no longer brought him the voices of his children, but only the echo of all he had lost. In every telling, the truth did not change. He had begun to withdraw from life. The hands that had once commanded nature through melody weakened, and his gaze turned not beyond the city, but only toward the darkness within himself. In the end, he could no longer remain standing beneath that pain. In some accounts, he leaned upon his sword and ended his own life. In others, his heart could not endure the weight of mourning. However it happened, the result remained the same. Amphion fell. His death, or his conscious withdrawal from the world, marked the moment when the house of Thebes lost not only its children, but also the pillar that had carried it. The foundations of the palace did not shift from their place, but the soul of the dynasty broke at that very point. With Amphion's fall, the very air of Thebes changed completely. The vitality that had once spread over the city, the sounds that had risen during festivals, the graceful movement that had passed through the palace corridors, and the proud sense of security felt behind the walls, all gave way to a heavy, dull, and drawn-out silence. The people no longer spoke loudly, no longer lingered in the squares, and began to retreat to their homes more quickly when evening came. Everyone felt that this disaster had not remained within the palace walls alone. The joy of Thebes had once been read in the face of the royal family. Now that same face gave the whole city its measure of grief. The loss of the children had been the sorrow of a dynasty, but Amphion's collapse turned that sorrow into a historical darkness. It was no longer only the mourning of a single family. The city had also lost its founding strength and the voice that had made it feel secure. Once Amphion's lyre fell silent, Thebes seemed to have lost not only its king, but its own soul as well. The weight of the disaster grew so vast that the dead could not be laid into the earth at once. For 9 days, the mourning that stood between the palace and the city seemed to stop even the flow of time. Neither could the rites be carried out in their former order, nor could the people restore the ordinary rhythm that should have followed death. The absence of the children and of the king remained so fresh, so burning, that even the act of burial was delayed. Over Thebes hung a heavy waiting, as though the gods themselves had imposed it. During those 9 days, the streets stayed hushed, the temples stayed smoky, and the houses stayed dark. When people looked at one another, they did not know what to say, because before such destruction, language too failed. In the palace, footsteps slowed, doors opened and closed more quietly, and even the eyes of the servants dropped to the ground. Mourning was no longer only a feeling. It became a physical weight that settled into every object that was touched, every stone that was sat upon, and every breath that was taken. For 9 days, Thebes lived in the silence of a living tomb. Niobe, meanwhile, had passed beyond even weeping in those days. The scream that had burst from her in the first blows, then that final plea that had risen while she tried to protect her daughters, now gave way to something even more frightening, hardening. Her tears had not ended, but the human warmth behind those tears had begun to freeze. To witness Amphion's collapse made her live through the absence of the children again, and in a heavier way. Now before her stood not only the ruin of motherhood, but also the ruin of marriage and of kingship. The woman who had once defined herself through the number of her children, the strength of her husband, and the splendor of her city, withdrew further inward as she watched each of those supports being pulled away one by one. Her face grew more motionless, and her voice turned into a hollow depth from which sound rose. Everyone in the palace sensed a change in Niobe. She still lived, still looked, still breathed, but what lay behind her gaze was no longer only mourning, but a slow inner hardening moving toward petrification. It was as though pain passed through flesh and bone and turned her soul itself into matter. When the time for burial finally came at the end of the 9 days, Thebes was no longer the old Thebes. The king's house had emptied, the security of the walls had lost its meaning, and the splendor of the palace had faded beneath the shadow of grief. Amphion's lyre had fallen silent, and the voices of the children would not return. What remained was not only the number of the losses, but the vastness of the emptiness they left behind. At this final stage, Niobe was no longer only a woman in mourning, but someone in whom an irreversible transformation had begun. As everything around her came apart, she too froze from within and slowly sank into a grief that stripped away her human movement. Thus, the collapse of the dynasty was completed. First the children were gone, then the father fell, and afterward the city sank into silence. This collective disaster felt like the ending not only of a family, but of an age. And Niobe stood at the very center of that ending, not yet turned to stone, yet already broken too deeply ever to return to her former vitality, inwardly drawing closer and closer to stone. When the dawn of the 10th day rose over the 7-gated walls of Thebes with a pale and reluctant light, the morning that had hung suspended for 9 days finally reached its end in the language of the earth. The gods, or the unseen power that carried out the gods' command, entrusted Niobe's children to the ground one by one, and brought the rotting suspense that had hovered over the palace and the city for days to a heavy conclusion. But what ended with the burial was not pain, only its outward form. For although the bodies of her children were laid in the earth, the emptiness inside Niobe grew even more distinct. For 9 days, her soul had overflowed with screams, laments, sobs, and terror. Now, it entered another stage. She no longer stood face to face with the lifeless bodies before her eyes, but with an absence that would never return. The palace of Thebes, once a marble dwelling filled with the voices of children, had now turned into a vast chamber of silence where mourning had settled. That morning, for the first time, Niobe understood deep within herself that the disaster was not temporary, that it had now become her life itself. When the burial rite ended, the body reminded her once more of a truth older than the soul. For 9 days, Niobe had lived with her pain, wept, cried out, and placed her grief above hunger and time. But the human body, no matter how vast the sorrow, never gave up enforcing its own command. At some point she felt it. As her knees trembled, as her voice barely emerged, as her hands hung in emptiness without purpose, a primitive need rose within her and reminded her of food. That reminder was not a shameful weakness, but the harshest lesson of mortality. From the outside, reaching for a piece of bread might have looked like an ordinary movement. Yet in that moment, no act weighed more heavily on Niobe. That bite meant accepting that life still continued after her children. Her pain had not eased, her mourning had not lessened, and her soul still lay in ruins. And yet her body refused to break the chain of life. As Niobe raised the bread to her mouth, she felt with full naked clarity that the woman who had once seen herself as near divine superiority had now become nothing more than a mortal forced to survive. That was when the true inner reckoning began. The first morning lived through screams gave way to the heavier torment of thought. Niobe could no longer escape the words she had hurled into the square. Her voice that had belittled Leto, her gaze that had taken the number of her children as proof of superiority, her proud bearing that had displayed her lineage, her wealth, and her city as if they were signs of untouchability, all of it now returned to her one by one. The more righteous and elevated she once believed herself to be when she spoke those words, the more naked and terrible they now appeared to her. The language of her pride began to speak against her at the graves of her children. She could no longer defend herself, because the ruin that had unfolded had stripped every defense of meaning. Neither being the daughter of Tantalus, nor the confidence she placed in the line of Atlas, nor Amphion's power, nor the walls of Thebes had protected her. Only the weight of the spoken words remained. At times, a person suffered the heaviest punishment, not from blows that came from outside, but from the sentences that had once left their own mouth. And on that day, Niobe heard the echo of her disaster most clearly in her own words. For that reason, silence turned into a punishment heavier than screaming. The cries of the first days had torn through the body, but sound still gave a person some path of release. Pain flowed outward and shifted, if only a little, with tears. But now there was only silence. The stones around Niobe, the empty halls, the closing doors, and the curtains trembling lightly in the wind all stood like signs of a world that gave her no answer. When the queen did not speak, the palace fell silent with an even louder force. That silence deepened not only the emptiness around her, but the collapse within her. The woman who had once silenced the people of Thebes with her command was now being crushed inside her own silence. For there were no words left that she could speak. There was no child she could bring back, no sentence she could correct, and no order she could restore. Silence stood around her, not like a veil of mourning, but like a judgment. With every passing hour, the inside of that silence hardened a little more. When Niobe stepped out of the fire of screaming and into the cold of silence, she learned that the true lasting form of pain was not sound, but silence. Thebes too drew away from Niobe within that silence. The city where she had once been queen no longer seemed to belong to her. The marble courtyards of the palace had lost the footsteps of her children. Amphion's lyre had fallen silent. The living warmth that once greeted her in the corridors had given way to hesitant glances and restrained breaths. The city still stood, but for her it was no longer a home. Every stone reminded her of a loss. Every door opened onto an absence, and every hall showed not its former splendor, but the life that had now been torn from her hands. Once, she had seen herself as the center of Thebes. Now that center had been emptied out. Her husband was gone. Her sons were gone. Her daughters were gone, and the joy that had nourished her motherhood was gone. The throne might still have remained in its place, but everything that had given it meaning had been erased. For that reason, Niobe's bond with the city broke in an unseen way. At times a person remained where they were, yet no longer belonged there. Niobe stood in Thebes in exactly that way, inside the walls, but outside life, in the middle of the palace, but homeless, among the living but entirely severed from her own past. And so the 10th day came to its close, not only as the day of burial, but as the day when Niobe passed from outward ruin into inward ruin. The first blows had taken her children. Then they had stripped her husband and her palace of meaning. Now pain itself began to take on another form within her soul. She was no longer the woman who struggled, begged, and cried out. In her place stood someone slowly freezing from within and carrying even her own existence like a crushing burden. The hand that reached for bread declared her mortality. The mouth that fell silent declared her helplessness, and the emptied Thebes declared the nothingness that remained behind. The queen who had once walked with the feeling that she stood above the blows of fate now sat at the very center of fate and found nowhere left to escape. That was where the power of silence revealed itself. It turned Niobe not only into a grieving mother, but into a shadow staring at the ashes of her own life. Nothing in Thebes belonged to her anymore. What remained was only an inner world beginning to turn to stone, an unending emptiness, and a terrible truth that showed how deep a loneliness a human being could fall into when left alone with their own pride. When there was no longer a single branch left for her to hold on to in Thebes, Niobe looked at the stones of the palace one last time one morning and decided to leave. This decision was not a sudden escape made in anger, but the final turning of a soul that had been completely hollowed out from within. The magnificent palace that had once exalted her had now turned into a cold shell that showed her nothing but her losses. Every corridor, every column, every courtyard reminded her not of her children's voices, but of their absence. Amphion's silenced lyre hung on the walls like the extinguished pulse of the kingdom. Among those stones, Niobe walked not like a queen, but like the ghost of her own disaster. At last, she understood that staying in that city would not lighten her grief. It would only wound her again with every step. So she turned her face toward the land where she had been born. For sometimes, after the heaviest defeat, a person wanted to return to the place where that first step had been taken. But Niobe's longing to return was not the longing of a girl seeking comfort. It was more the silent walk of a soul being called to account before its own past. Her departure from Thebes was not magnificent. There was no ceremony, no crowd to see her off, and no loud voices rising behind her. She had once passed through that city in a bridal procession, with hope and splendor. Now she left behind graves, silent stones, and an extinguished dynasty. The bodies of her 7 sons and 7 daughters laid into the earth had now separated her from that city in a way that could never be reversed. Amphion's memory remained within that same palace as well. His music, his face, and the partnership in rule she had built with him were now, for Niobe, only the shadow of an age that had closed. As she left, she carried with her neither the weight of her jewels nor the pride of her throne. The only thing that traveled with her was the pain that had sunk into her and the guilt that no longer fit anywhere. The things she left behind were not only people, she also left her former self in Thebes. That was why the woman who set out on the road was no longer the same person as the young and proud queen who had once come to that city. Her turn towards Sipylos was not simply a return to a homeland. It was the movement of a soul being pulled back to its roots under the weight of destruction. Sometimes, after the greatest pain, a person imagined that returning to the very beginning might help gather the self back together. Perhaps in the first hours of the road, Niobe also thought that the shadow of the mountains of her childhood might calm her, if only a little. But as soon as the first stretches of the journey had passed, she began to understand that this was not a road leading to peace. The land where she had been born had preserved not only her innocence, but also the first seeds of her pride. Sipylos held not only her childhood, but also that boundless sense of superiority that had grown within her in the palace of Tantalos, that first look with which she had believed herself close to the gods, and the days when she had passed side by side with Leto. That was why, as the road lengthened, the silence within Niobe became heavier. As she moved farther from Thebes, her grief did not grow lighter. On the contrary, Her past stood before her in a more naked form. That road was now carrying not only her body backward, but her memory as well. Every landscape that appeared before her during the journey opened an old door in her mind. The bank of a stream reminded her of the cool days of her childhood play. A distant hill brought back the horizons she had once watched from the balconies of the palace of Sipylos, and the wind that blew at night carried to her ears once more the years when her father Tantalos's name had been spoken in whispers. It was in those moments that Niobe began, for the first time, to look at her past, not only with longing but with judgment. She thought of the bloodline in which she had once taken pride, and she could no longer deny that it had given her not wisdom, but excess. She thought of Leto, and with pain she realized how she had one day turned that quiet girl, with whom she had once walked side by side in childhood, into the target of her contempt. Her own words returned to her again along the road. Every sentence she had hurled before the people in the square now multiplied in her ears like an ominous cry echoing across an empty plain. As the road stretched on, Niobe understood more deeply that the punishment given by the gods had not come only from outside. Part of it had also been the judgment a person built against oneself with one's own tongue. That was why the journey turned step by step into a reckoning. Niobe no longer counted only her losses. She also thought about the blindness with which she had lost them, as the faces of her sons, the laughter of her daughters, Amphion's silence, and the final screams in the palace blended together in her memory. She began to see them all beneath the shadow of one great word: her own pride. But that realization brought her no relief. On the contrary, seeing the source of the guilt not outside herself but within her only made her pain heavier. For a person could be angry at the harshness of fate and resent the wrath of the gods, but once that person understood that the door to disaster had been opened by one's own hand, no excuse remained to hide behind. That was why Niobe's silence deepened. Even if she had traveling companions, she did not speak to them. Whether she drank water, rested, or began to walk again, that same invisible burden remained on her shoulders. Every step she took towards Sipylos meant not only drawing closer to her childhood, but also drawing closer to the root of her guilt. She was no longer returning to the place where she had been born. She was going before her own judgment. When the silhouette of Sipylos appeared in the distance, no unexpected peace arose within Niobe. On the contrary, the rise of the mountain looked to her less like a refuge than like the gate of a court. That mountain, in whose shadow she had once grown, and whose wind she had once felt with the face of a child, now seemed foreign, harsh, and silent to her. For when a person changed, the place of birth also changed in that person's eyes. For Niobe, Sipylos was no longer the land of innocence. It had turned into a place of judgment, where in every rock she felt the excess of Tantalos, on every slope the beginning of her own pride, and in every silence the absence of her children. As she drew closer to the foot of the mountain, it was as if the stones knew her but did not forgive her. Neither the wind offered comfort, nor the landscape offered mercy. Everything struck her in the face with the truth she had been fleeing for so long. She had lost not only her children, but measure as well. That was why the sight of Sipylos did not bring Niobe rest. On the contrary, it deepened the freezing within her a little more. Reaching the place where she had been born had not meant coming home. It had meant standing directly before judgment. Thus, Niobe's return to Sipylos was completed, like the final journey of a woman who had been cut off from the outside world. In Thebes, she had left behind the graves, the palace, and the memory of Amphion. On the road, she had faced her childhood, her bloodline, and the shadow of her own words. And in the end, she had understood that the mountain where she had been born no longer opened its arms to her. The grief she carried throughout the journey had ceased to be only a mother's loss, and had turned into the silent proof of how a person collapsed after crossing the limits of the self. When Niobe arrived at Sipylus, there was no kingdom left in her hands, no maternal pride, and no trust in the past. What remained was only a heavy inner emptiness, a silence slowly hardening, and a human being growing smaller before the mountain. That was why this return was not a peaceful journey back to the beginning. It was the coming of a woman who had fallen from the highest place in life to the soil where she had taken her first step, so that she might stand before her own broken self. Sipylos had become for her not a motherland, but the silent mirror of the final truth. When Niobe reached Sipylos, she no longer walked like a woman carrying the fatigue of a long journey, but like a shadow driven to the furthest limit of grief. The graves she had left behind in Thebes, the silenced palace, and the faded memory of Amphion had traveled with her all along the road. By the time she reached the foot of the mountain, all of them had settled onto her shoulders as a single weight. Those slopes that had once cooled her childhood no longer showed her mercy. Instead, they rose like silent witnesses, casting her past back into her face. The wind was still the same wind, and the rocks were still the same rocks. But Niobe's gaze had changed. Once, she had felt her nobility, her privilege, and the superiority that fate had granted her there. Now, on that same mountain, she heard only the echo of all she had lost. Every step she took seemed to call her children's names back out of the stones, yet no voice answered her. It was in that moment that she felt with complete nakedness for the first time that even the grief a human being could carry had a limit, and that her own burden had long since passed it. As she climbed higher toward the steep rocks of Sipylos, both Niobe's body and her soul began to grow strange to one another. For days, she had found neither the true refuge of sleep nor any clear sense of the ordinary pain of hunger and thirst. The loss of 14 children, the fall of Amphion, and the irreversible echo of her own arrogant words had overturned every human order within her. Even the tears, the cries, and the movement to which a mourning mother clung would at some point run dry. Niobe had reached that threshold. As she walked, her knees trembled, and she could not move forward without holding onto the rocks. Yet the true weight rested not in her body, but in the very center of her being. She had once carried her children in her arms, then in her memory, and then in her screams. Now her grief had grown so vast that it had become impossible to contain it within flesh and bone. It was as though sorrow had multiplied beyond what a body could hold, and had begun to turn her into an in-between being, stone within and human without. Even if Niobe did not understand in that moment that this was the first step of transformation, her spirit had already begun to stiffen inside matter. When she stopped on one of the mountain's harshest ledges, nothing called return remained anymore. She could not go back to Thebes, or to the innocent days of childhood, or to the self she had been before the words she had once spoken. She looked toward the horizon, but what she saw was not a landscape. It was the shattered face of her own life. She felt at once the fall of her 7 sons along the hunting path, her daughters drawing close to their mother in fear inside the palace, Amphion's silent collapse, and that proud voice she had raised against Leto in the square. This was not only the moment when she remembered the past, it was the moment when the past judged her with its full weight. Had the gods brought her to this point, or fate, or the judgment she had pronounced with her own tongue? Perhaps all of them had. Perhaps one of the oldest truths of the Greek world had taken form there. The human being who exceeded all measure had in the end collapsed beneath the weight of the self. At that very edge, Niobe gave up trying to make sense of pain. Some disasters did not allow explanation. They were only carried. Some wrongs were never forgiven. They only changed shape. The woman standing among the rocks of Sipylos was about to pass beyond human sorrow. Then the petrification began, not with a scream, but like a heavy decision rising out of silence. First, movement withdrew from her face. Her eyelids, exhausted from weeping, fell into the dull stillness of an endless sleeplessness. Then the trembling in her shoulders weakened. The last warmth in her fingers began to drain away, and even the frail will that had kept her knees upright took on a weight like the hardness of rock. This was not death, because Niobe still felt, nor was it deliverance because her pain did not cease. It was rather a new form raised by the gods or by fate between her body and her soul, so that her grief might become eternal. Niobe suffered the punishment of a mother who had not been able to stop living, yet had no strength left with which to live. As the hardness of stone replaced her flesh, the heart of a mother within her still kept aching. That was the most terrible part of the transformation. Movement withdrew, warmth faded, and as her human form drew closer to rock, feeling did not disappear. Even as her body turned to stone, Niobe continued to feel pain, and for that reason her transformation became a fate heavier than death. From that moment on, a new being came into existence on Sipylos, the eternal mother who could weep but could not move. Niobe was no longer a woman who walked, spoke, and called for her children, yet tears still did not leave her. The tears that ran down her face of stone seemed like everything the body forgot and the soul could not forget seeping outward. The wind could no longer lift her hair, her feet could no longer carry her anywhere, and her hands could no longer reach out to grasp absence. Yet grief remained there, like a wound kept alive inside stone. That was why Niobe ceased to be an ordinary mortal and became a figure of legend. Her story was no longer only the story of a queen who had lost her children. It had become the union of arrogance, maternal pain, and divine punishment in a single body. That body of stone standing on the slope of Sipylos was not, in time, seen merely as a piece of rock. People began to see in her all at once the cost of pride that had crossed its limit and a grief too vast for any mother to bear. Thus, Niobe remained at the threshold where pain passed from the human into myth. The truly terrifying side of this transformation lay in the fact that it had not been merely a disaster, but a judgment made visible. Niobe had once counted the number of her children as a mark of superiority, had belittled Leto's motherhood, and had seen herself as greater even than the blows of fate. Now that same woman stood, in her unmoving stone body, directly opposite those very words. Her arrogance was no longer an idea. It had become a punishment, that could be seen with the eye. This stone mother that appeared among the rocks of Sipylus carried at once both the proud queen of the past and the prisoner of endless grief. Her petrification was not the end of the god's anger, but the permanence of punishment. Death might have been temporary. What Niobe had been given was a form that would not be forgotten. From then on, every drop that slipped down the mountain would have been seen as her unceasing tear, and everyone who looked at the rock would have sensed the endless sob of a mother there. In this way, Niobe remained at the furthest point human suffering could reach, neither fully dead nor fully alive, neither wholly human nor wholly stone. She remained only as the eternal image of pride carved into the body, and as the unceasing tear of motherhood. With Niobe's petrification, the life of a solitary woman did not simply end on the steep slopes of Sipylos. The visible body of a legend came into being. Those who passed along the mountain's foothills had at first seen nothing there but harsh rocks battered by the wind. Yet as days chased months and months chased the seasons, whispers began to multiply around that stone body. For when one looked at a certain slope of the mountain from a certain distance, more than an ordinary mass of rock came into view. The silhouette of a woman with her head bowed, her shoulders collapsed, crushed beneath her own weight by the grief rising from within her. The people did not think this was a random trick of nature. In their eyes, Sipylos had held in its breast the daughter of Tantalos, who had once grown up proudly in these lands, and had now sealed that same woman onto its slopes as the silent monument of her own sin. Thus, the story of the Weeping Rock was born. Niobe was no longer only a queen who had once lived in the past, but had become a presence standing upon the mountain and silently telling her own story to anyone who looked at her. In time, that rock grew beyond the pain of a single person and became part of the people's memory. As those living at the foot of Sipylos showed this rock to their children, they did not tell only an old tale. They also taught how a human being collapsed when they overstepped their limits. Niobe's name no longer called to mind a magnificent queen who had ruled in palaces, but a mother remembered as a warning. Those who remembered her no longer thought first of the proud woman who had borne 7 sons and 7 daughters, but of the grieving mother who had turned to stone because she had counted the number of her children as a mark of superiority. In this way, the legend ceased to be a family story and turned into a shared warning. Every eye that looked upon the mountain came to see in that rock not only the outline of a face, but the end of unmeasured pride. As Niobe's disaster passed from mouth to mouth, her presence continued to live on like an example that drew people in and unsettled them at the same time. She was no longer a person alone. She had become a lesson to be told across generations, a memory turned to stone, and the very shape of pain made visible. Nature also did not allow this legend to be forgotten. The drops of water seeping from the crevices in the rock sometimes looked bright and sometimes dull, depending on the sun's direction and the coolness of the air. Yet the people always understood them in the same way. They were Niobe's unceasing tears. When the wind blew across the ridges of Spil, the moaning among the rocks did not sound like an ordinary voice of nature. Many heard it as an old sob coming from within that stone body. The morning dew, the dampness of evening, the thin trickles slipping through the rocks, all of them were taken as silent signs that a mother was still weeping. In this way, Niobe's mourning blended into the cycle of nature, When rain fell, her sorrow seemed to deepen. When sunlight struck, her tears shone with light. And when night descended, the dark silhouette of the rock took on an even heavier grief. After a time, when people looked at this mountain, they could no longer separate nature from legend. For on Spil, stone, water, wind, and silence all told the same story together. The storytellers of antiquity and the travelers who came from distant lands also could not escape the power of this sight. Every traveler approaching Sipylos first took the formation before them for an ordinary rock, then shuddered when, after stepping back and looking from the right angle, they saw the silhouette of a grieving woman emerge from within that stone. Thus, Niobe's story began to live not only in popular legend, but also in travelers' tales, temple conversations, and ancient narratives. Those who saw it thought that the mountain carried not only stone, but memory as well. On one side, there was geography. Steep slopes, windy passes, rock faces gleaming beneath the sun. On the other, stood human pain soaked into that landscape. And it was precisely this union that made Niobe immortal. The legend endured not only because it was told, but because it could also be seen. Nature had lent its shoulder to human speech, and the stories had given a tongue to the rock's silence. In this way, the slopes of Spil turned into a place of memory where grief was not forgotten. The way the rock seemed to weep turned Niobe's mourning from a temporary tragedy into something lasting. People could bury their dead and watch their grief grow lighter with time. But for Niobe, even the passage of time brought no remedy, for her pain was bound to the rock. In every season, in every light, and in every new generation, she continued to appear in that same collapsed posture. Beneath the harsh sun of summer, her face might have seemed dried out, yet in the coolness of a morning she could still be made out with tear-filled eyes. Even when the wind of winter passed over her, the people spoke the same words again when the waters of spring ran down the face of the rock in thin lines. Niobe was weeping again. That repetition gave the legend an extraordinary permanence, for the loss no longer belonged only to the past. It had turned into a wound seen again each day, interpreted again, and felt again. On Spil, mourning did not close itself inside a memory. It became a living sign that continued across the face of the stone. In this way, Niobe's suffering spread across a span of time greater than a human life. In the end, Niobe's story was fixed completely to a place. The disaster that had taken place in Thebes, the deaths of the children, Amphion's collapse, and a mother's heart turning to stone, were no longer only a myth passed on in words. They had become a presence on the slopes of Spil that could be seen, pointed out, and tied to the land itself. For that reason, the weeping rock did not remain only a shape of nature. It became the face of pride carved into stone, the form of maternal grief sealed into geography, and a part of human memory that resisted forgetting. Passers-by, shepherds, travelers, poets, and tellers of history all looked upon the same rock with different eyes, yet all of them saw a silent judgment there. Niobe was no longer someone lying beneath the earth. She had become an inscription written on the face of the mountain. In this way, the tragedy passed from individual pain into collective memory. Spil did not hide her, on the contrary, it raised her up, displayed her, and carried her through time to future generations. That was why the weeping rock turned into not only Niobe's eternal guardian, but also a reminder of where human beings arrived when they forgot their own limits. Niobe's story was not forgotten through the ages, because this narrative did not remain only as a great disaster that befell an unfortunate queen. In her story, people saw not only a mother's unbearable grief, but also how a human being walked toward the abyss when they forgot their own limits. Countless wars, countless dynasties, countless palaces scattered and vanished in the flow of time, but Niobe's name continued to live on. The reason for this was that her suffering was not ordinary. Instead of making the blessings in her hands a subject of gratitude, she had treated them as proof of her superiority. She had seen her lineage, her wealth, the number of her children, and the splendor in which she lived as armor that made her untouchable. And it was exactly there that the disaster had been born, because the greatest illusion of human beings was to believe that the things they possessed saved them from fragility. What happened to Niobe was told from generation to generation for this reason. She was remembered not only for what she lost, but also for why she lost it. What gave this story its permanence was the way the great circles within it connected to one another with flawless precision. First, hubris rose. That is, a human being placed themselves above their proper measure, mistook abundance for deserved superiority, and attempted to rival divine order. Then the divine response came, silent, certain, and irreversible. After that, a mother's grief entered the story and separated it from being a dry account of punishment. If Niobe had been punished only as a proud queen, perhaps her name would have faded away among other mythological offenders. But she had also become a mother, collapsed beneath the loss of her children. In that way, the story became not only a moral warning, but one of the deepest wounds of the human spirit. In the end, petrification came and fixed all of it into a single form. Pride, punishment, grief, and helplessness merged in one body. That was what made Niobe immortal. Her story was not only told, it was turned into form. It was not only heard, it was made visible. For that reason, the name Sipylus did not remain only as the name of an ancient mountain. Today, this geography was known as Mount Spil, rising south of Manisa province in Turkey. In official cultural and tourism sources as well, Mount Spil and the Niobe rock monument on its slopes, known as the Weeping Rock, were clearly identified as the setting of the Niobe legend. According to the records of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, this natural rock formation was located on the slope of Mount Spil, and especially when viewed from the southern face, gave the silhouette of a woman's head. Since ancient times, people had believed that this was the mythological Niobe. In the cultural narratives of that same region, the Weeping Rock of Niobe on the slopes of Mount Spil, Tantalus, and other layers of ancient myth were mentioned together. That point was exactly what lifted the legend out of being only an event that happened in the distant past. Because Niobe's story did not close and remain trapped on the pages of books. Even today, for someone looking toward the slopes of Spil in Manisa, it became visible again within stone, water, and silence. The moisture that slipped down the surface of the Weeping Rock, the collapsed expression in the silhouette of the stone, the hard lines of the mountain, and the story living in the memory of the people blended into one another. In that way, geography and memory became one. When a person looked there, they did not say only, "Once upon a time, a myth like this was told." At the same time, they felt, "This story was left here." When a legend became tied to a place, it became more convincing, more lasting, and more shattering. That was exactly why the Weeping Rock, standing on the slopes of Sipylus, that is, present-day Spil, mattered. It kept Niobe alive not only in words, but also in the silence of stone. That turned pain from a temporary event into a wound of shared memory that remained forever open. But Niobe's story was not told only to frighten, it was told to teach. And the core of that lesson was this: the moment a human being began to treat the blessing in their hands as proof of their own greatness, they also moved closer to losing it. Because abundance, power, lineage, fame, beauty, or success were not crimes in themselves. The crime was turning them into a measureless sense of self. Niobe fell, not because she loved her children, but because she put her children forward in the language of superiority. The words she spoke against Leto were not only proud, they were words that crossed the line. That was why her story remained valid for people in every age. Even if we were not kings or queens today, we could still fall into the illusion of thinking that what we possessed was untouchable. A family, an achievement, a position, a fortune, or a talent could begin to make us feel superior to others and safe from harm. Niobe's petrified silence gave its warning at exactly that point. To possess something did not mean being able to keep it forever. To trust in abundance did not mean being exempt from fate. Another great lesson of the story was built on motherhood and humanity. Niobe first spoke with pride, then fell silent with grief. At the beginning, she counted the number of her children like a triumph. In the end, the absence of those same children cast her into the heaviest mourning a human being could bear. For that reason, the story did not deliver only a dry conclusion like, "Do not be proud, or you will be punished." It said something deeper. At times, a person was tested through the very thing they took the greatest pride in. The place they trusted most could become the place where they were most defenseless. That was where Niobe's tragedy became universal. Because this was not only a matter concerning the gods of the ancient world, it concerned the structure of the human spirit. We bound ourselves so deeply to the things we thought belonged to us that we treated them as extensions of our own identity. When they were shaken, we did not experience loss alone. We also felt that we ourselves had been broken apart. Niobe became the most extreme example of that fracture. That was why her story awakened not only a sense of warning, but also a deep feeling of compassion. That was also why the Weeping Rock was still thought of as a warning even today. A person who looked at it saw not only pride that had been punished, but also a mother who had never stopped mourning. The silence of the rock reminded us of two things at once: the price of crossing the line and the irreparability of loss. Perhaps that was why the figure of Niobe was not one-dimensional. She was neither only guilty nor only a victim. She was both a human being who had called her own disaster down upon herself and a mother crushed beneath the disaster she had called. That duality saved the story from simplicity. The rock standing on the slopes of Spil did not deliver a single judgment to a person. It did not speak with a single emotion either. It stirred both fear and pity. It showed the line from which we needed to draw back, and it also revealed how fragile the human heart was. That was why the legend of Niobe did not explain only the past. It also placed a burden on people today to think about their own voice, their own pride, and their own limits. In the end, The eternal echo of Sipylus left us with this truth. The moment a human being placed themselves above life, they received a lesson harsher than life itself. Niobe once believed that she was rising toward the heavens with her wealth, her lineage, her city, and her children. Yet what truly kept a human being standing was not rising, but knowing their limits. Blessing without gratitude turned into pride. Pride turned into contempt, and contempt turned into destruction. Niobe's story was the most striking form of that chain, and today in Manisa, the weeping rock remembered on the slopes of Mount Spil seemed to still hold the final link of that chain on the face of the stone. What stood there was not only a rock. The cost of excess, the pain of motherhood, and a lesson of humanity that should not have been forgotten stood there as well. That was why the story did not end. Even though Niobe's voice could no longer be heard, her silence continued to speak. And perhaps the heaviest lesson was exactly this. At times it was not words that disciplined a human being, but the petrified silence of regret that had come too late. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.